expect Kylo Ren to have such a big nose? That was like the only thing he got from it, is the size of Adam Driver's nose.
And big ears.
Hey everybody, and
He got
welcome
made fun
to
of that
Camera
for a lot. I feel
Academy.
bad for
What's
Kylo.
that? Huh?
Said he got made fun of that for a lot. I feel bad for Kylo.
Well, he shouldn't have been so emo.
That's why he's so angry.
I know, because everyone's making fun of him on social media.
Anyway.
Hey everybody, welcome to Camera Academy, and also the place where we will be reviewing the latest Star Wars movie. If you can't tell, I'm not feeling well. I have a little bit of a cold, and my voice is a little bit screwed up, so forgive me. This might be a tough one to sit through. But the good news is we'll be talking about ISO.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that, who will be talking about ISO, you say? Why, me, Nick from Cometa Camera, as well as my cohort Nikolai, also from Cometa Camera. And you can, of course, visit us on cometa.com, where you can get all of the cameras and photo accessories that you need. Yes, this episode is brought to you by Cometa Camera. We don't have advertisement because we're a store.
Yeah.
We're selling stuff.
And we're getting paid to do this right now.
So you don't have to skip through any ads except for the part where we talk about our own employer, which is
Cometa Camera.
Cometa Camera.
Cometa.com.
At Cometa.com. And if you want to get in touch with us, of course, you can find us on Facebook.com/Cometa Camera, at Cometa on Twitter, Cometa Camera on Instagram, and of course you can email the two of us at social@Cometa.com, because we're the social media gurus. And I don't know about gurus, that's not really a good term for it, because we're not really any good
and
at
anyway,
it,
that's our 1 minute long shameless plug.
So today we're going to be talking about ISO on Camera Academy. Now, ISO, of course, is 1/3 of the exposure triangle, which we have covered in our first few episodes. And of course, that makes it very important in capturing not only a sharp image in a clean image, but also a well-exposed image. So ISO, very important, although many people, especially those who are first starting off in photography, don't really know what it is.
Yeah, and ISO actually is very simple to understand once you get past the initials of it, which really have no, I guess...
Well, we'll explain what it is. Basically, ISO dates back to film days, and in film days, even prior to the 1970s, it was known as, film speed was known as ASA, and it was based on a standards organization, right? So ASA was the American Standards Association, and your film speed was based upon their determination of what the sensitivity your film had.
Yeah.
And your film's sensitivity was, at the time, was based upon the size of the silver crystals in your film. And the bigger the silver crystals, the more sensitive your film. And if you had a more sensitive type film, like if your film was ASA, whatever, 800, you had a film that could work better in low light, but you'd also have you'd have really grainy pictures because of the size of the physical grains of material that were in your film.
Yes.
Later on in the 70s, or late 70s, 80s, they changed it to ISO, was the worldwide sort of accepted standard. That stands for International Standards Organization. And basically the numbers continued on sort of in the same vein, where ISO 100 was the least sensitive. ISO 400 is something you would use if you were in indoor situations, and then ISO 800 film would be something you'd use in really dire situations. You'd have really grainy pictures as a result.
Yeah, so basically...
all that means nothing.
Exactly. So now basically
now
all you
get
need,
your history lesson.
all you need to know is what ISO is, and ISO is basically your camera's sensitivity to light.
Correct. Which is a much faster and more succinct way of saying it.
Yes, that's the basic, easy way to say it.
All right. So if you have a low ISO, say you're starting at ISO 100, you're going to get a very clean image. It's not going to have hardly any noise at all, and that is basically what we want to get. If we want to work with bright lighting in photography, because we want to have a nice clean image with no noise. But
you need a lot of light.
You need to have a lot of light because your camera's sensor, basically your camera's sensor, the gain is basically at neutral when you are shooting at ISO 100. The higher up you go in ISO, the more sensitive your camera sensor becomes, and it's basically turning up the gain.
Yeah, basically
it's
think that
gonna-
your sensor's getting hotter and hotter.
Yeah, and so it's going to introduce more brightness to your image, but on the other hand, it's also going to introduce more grain to your image. So ideally, you want to be able to shoot with good lighting and fast shutter speed and whatever aperture you want to work at. But sometimes those situations occur where you have to shoot at a higher ISO so that you can compensate. It's the whole exposure triangle thing, and it's tough it is tough to explain over a medium such as this. But basically, ISO is another way of increasing your exposure to compensate for shutter speed and aperture.
Yeah, so let's say you have like an aperture of like 5.6 and a shutter speed of 100th of a second, and your ISO is set to 100, and your picture's coming out really, really dark, but you want to keep your settings the way you have them as far as your shutter speed and your aperture goes. You don't want to change those, because let's say you're hand holding and you really just need that 5.6 depth of field. The only thing you're going to be able to adjust is your ISO. You can bump that up to like 400 or 800, or you might even have to go higher, but that's basically another way to get a proper exposure. You're just going to start introducing artifacts and noise into your picture.
All right, so what situations would you use a low ISO in, and what situations would you use a high ISO in, and what benefits does a low or a high ISO give you?
Well, first off, like you said before, a lower ISO gives you a clearer picture with virtually no noise.
Right.
So if you're shooting like a landscape, or you want something that needs high detail, you would shoot in a low ISO. With that said, though, you need to have a good amount of light to do that, or your subject has to not be moving to the point where you can actually use a tripod, because you're going to need so much light that you're going to probably have a slow shutter speed and a decent size aperture.
Right, because ISO is, of course, part of the wonderful
Exposure
triangle. That's right. So having a proper ISO is important in getting a correct exposure.
Yeah. So let's say if you're shooting like a sunset or something like that, and you want, the clearest picture possible of it, you're probably going to be, if you're using ISO 100, you're going to probably be needing like at least an aperture of like 5.6. You can go lower to f4 depending on how far away you are from your foreground, and you're going to probably need a slower shutter speed. You're going to probably at least 60th of a second.
Right. So with a low ISO, you basically need a lot of light or a very fast lens.
Yes.
Or a very slow shutter speed, but you won't be using that in many situations.
Correct.
So, all right. What situations would you, personally, use a high ISO setting for? So let's say normally you're shooting at between, 100 and 800 or 1600. But occasionally you do have to bump it up. So what are some specific situations
bump
where
it up.
Yeah.
Pump that jam. My turn to interrupt now.
One thing that's missing from today's music, if I may say so, is that thing in the background of all techno music when they go,
like Mickey Mouse.
It wasn't Mickey. I can't do it now because I have a cold. But there was like a loop track that they used to use in the early '90s, and it was on like every freaking techno track. It was the same. It was all Technotronic used it all the time, and if you heard it, you'd know what I was talking about.
Anyway, back on topic. What was the question again?
What situations would you use a high ISO in? Obviously in the club when they're playing Technotronic and pump up the jam.
You would need to use a higher ISO in situations where you need a specific aperture and a specific shutter speed, but your image is still dark.
All right, so if we're in a dim situation, or we're trying to shoot sports or something like that where we need a very fast shutter speed.
Like your handheld, yeah.
Okay. You might need to dial up the ISO a little bit so that you can have a fast shutter speed in those situations where there's not enough light.
So let's say you're shooting like a football game or your son or daughter's soccer game or something like that.
Yep.
And your telephoto lens only stops down to like, let's say 5.6.
Which most of them do.
Yeah, so we'll say like 5.6 at your maximum zoom range is the lowest your camera can go, and your shutter speed's dropping down. If you're like in program or something like that, your shutter speed's dropping down to like a 40th of a second or something like that. You're not going to get a good image. Everything's going to be blurry.
Right.
So the only thing you can counter that then is to increase your ISO so that shutter speed comes up.
Now, most cameras will automatically set your ISO depending on what mode you're in, and they will give you a certain range between 100 usually and say 1600 to 3200.
Yeah.
But more often than not, your camera doesn't know what it is you're shooting, so you will have to manually change that so that you can increase your shutter speed.
Correct.
I will say that there are modes that will compensate. Like if you're using a sport mode, it will probably
have your ISO set up pretty high.
Optimize your ISO so that you will get a fast shutter speed.
Yes, it'll probably increase the limit on that automatic ISO
right
to a little bit higher than it usually would in another mode.
But sometimes you will just have to go ahead and go past the auto ISO and ratchet it up yourself a little bit.
Yes.
All right, so shooting sports, anywhere indoors where you're trying to catch any kind of action going on, or if you're hand-holding your camera, that's another good situation. Concerts would be a great use for a high ISO situation because obviously they're usually in the dark, and a lot of the times you don't mind a little bit of grain in those images. Places where you can't use flash photography, like museums or art galleries, things like that. Amusement parks, if you're on a ride and you really want to get a picture of the inside of, I don't know, It's a Small World, for God's sake.
Certain concert halls.
Yes.
I've shot in, I've shot in bands and stuff like that where I've had security come up to me and say, listen, you can't use flash right now. So the only other option you have there is really increasing your ISO.
Yes. Parties, any sort of other dimly lit situation, weddings.
You don't want to be using flash during the ceremony.
Absolutely not. And then something that you're pretty familiar with is if you want to use it for creative use.
Yes.
There are ways that you can apply that sort of graininess that occurs at high ISOs and make it work with your photos. So you, for example, work at haunted houses a lot.
Yes.
And do a lot of Halloween, and you shoot a lot of models that have themselves made up to look like zombies and things of that nature. So a high ISO, a grainy look works for that kind of photography.
Yeah, I mean, not only are you usually in like dim lit situations with that kind of stuff, you want the photos to look grungy. You want them to look kind of nasty.
Yeah.
So bumping the ISO up just naturally gives it that kind of almost like a dirty like filter over it.
Now, you could apply a filter like that in Photoshop or Lightroom or whatever, and you could have an approximation of that effect, but it's not the same.
Yeah, you can, but it basically just looks like you put a sheet of dots over your picture, unless you can do little things like edit the opacity on certain things, and I'm going to get technical here. You can edit the opacity on things and blotch it up a little bit. You can change the blend modes and stuff on them, but it's the best way to do it is shoot it right. So if you want to get it right as close as you can in camera to what you want to do with minimal editing having to do post-process. So
I would enjoy that if they changed the name of the filter to Sheet of Dots.
Sheet of Dots. I mean, you could probably just technically change the filter name to Sheet of Dots if you wanted to.
I don't think Adobe would appreciate it. No. There's like crappy Sheet of Dots that doesn't actually look like grain. That would be kind of a long title for a filter name.
But also on the topic of that, if you do have to wind up shooting a high ISO and you do get that film grain embedded in your picture and you don't want it there is stuff you can do to reduce the quote-unquote noise, which is what that stuff is called. Photoshop and Lightroom have noise reduction software built into it.
Okay.
Most cameras have noise reduction modes in there that you can apply to the picture, so when you just take the picture, it'll automatically reduce some noise.
How well do those work? Like if you have noise reduction in your camera and you apply it Like it's usually something you have to turn on in your menu.
Correct. You'd have to go in the menu and you'll see something that says noise reduction, and you can set it on to on.
So normally it's
low,
not something
medium, high.
that would be set on by default. It's usually something you'd have to turn on.
It's something
yourself.
you'd have to go in the menus and
So
find.
how would that affect your images? Would it make them kind of soft and weird looking?
Yeah,
or?
basically what it does is, the film grain is a kind of sharp looking dots.
Right.
So what it does is to eliminate that, it's going to try and smooth that out.
Okay.
So it's going to, when you use the noise reduction, it will soften your picture a little bit. Which
Okay.
can, you don't want too much of it, because then it just kind of makes it look almost like someone just smudge something over it.
Right.
So usually if I do use noise reduction, I do very minimal to it, to the point where it's just I do as little as I can to alter the picture.
It's probably something then that you should do with post-production software as opposed to in-camera, where you'll
Correct.
actually have more control over how the image looks.
Yeah.
And you'll have a bigger screen so you can look at it. I guess in a pinch it might work if you have to send your pictures out to somebody right away from your camera. Noise reduction might help soften the image a little bit, but I think by and large it's probably better to do it after the fact in post-production.
Yeah, it's always better to do a post-process, just because the software that Adobe puts out is just amazing as far as what it can do. But, again, if you just use the level 1 noise reduction, just low noise reduction that's built into your camera, you're not going to really, I don't think it's going to really soften it up to the point where you're going to really notice it. It's oh, that looks smudged.
Right.
And again, a lot of the times when you're looking at pictures on social media and stuff like that, you're not looking at it super big.
Yeah, well, that's an important distinction here, is to think about when you're shooting at a high ISO or any ISO, think about what your final product is going to be. If you think that your picture is going to basically end up as a social media picture, or you're going to make small prints, then maybe shooting at a higher ISO is not a bad idea, because that grain ultimately is going to be compressed and it's not going to really matter in the long run.
Yeah, especially if you're printing pictures, you're not going to really see it out like a 4x5 or an 8x10.
Certainly
just
not.
the nature of the ink.
Not at the resolution we have these
Yeah,
days.
exactly. Just the nature of the ink and the way it's printed, it's going to basically kind of reduce.
Right.
the
So better
noise.
to have a grainy picture that's sharp than a perfectly clean picture that's a bit too soft.
Exactly.
Because the softness will show up in your prints much more than the grain would.
Correct.
And we basically think that if you ever resize an image in Photoshop or something like that, you'll notice that whatever grain there is going to get substantially reduced when you reduce the size of the image.
Mhm.
That's just sort of how the compression works. And the same thing that'll apply to grainy images as well. So you can feel safe shooting at relatively high ISOs, 1600, 3200, and especially with modern digital cameras, they do a really good job of, let's just say the sensitivity is much better
Yeah.
than it was a few years ago. They've really upped the technology over the last few years.
And while we're on that topic, your sensor size has a direct correlation to your ISO
Yes, that
as
is
well.
important.
So basically, the larger your camera sensor is, the better it's going to be able to handle ISO. So let's say you're using your smartphone,
Yes.
and
God
you have
forbid.
one of those applications where you can, manually expose your camera.
Hmm.
Take a picture with that at ISO 800 and then compare it to your DSLR's picture at 800. You're going to see
If you
a
can even
lot.
change the ISO on your phone.
I
don't know
think
if you
with
can.
certain applications you can.
Okay.
So it's basically manual, a manual photography app
Right.
you can use. So you can put your camera in manual mode on it. But if you do that, you'll notice that the image sensor in your camera is very small.
Yes.
Very, very small. That's how they fit it in there.
Yeah. And on any really compact point and shoot camera as well.
Yeah. So, but if you compared that picture to, same settings you have in your, I don't know, what's a common camera now? Nikon D5600,
Sure.
Canon T6Is, T7Is.
Mhm.
Compared to that, you're going to see the ISO control at 800 is a lot better than the smartphone. And then if you go to a professional full frame camera like a 5D Mark IV or a D850 or a D610 or an A7, it's you're going to see the noise at 800 is almost, you can barely see it.
Yes, because essentially, when you have a larger sensor, you have larger pixels, and those pixels are capable of gathering more light.
Correct.
So
Yes.
in this case, size definitely matters, and a larger sensor is going to be better in low light situations. That is something that no amount of sort of software and technology is going to really be able to overcome. Not at this point.
Yeah. So if you are looking into buying a camera, you definitely need to think about that as well. If you know you're going to do a lot of low light work, it might be more beneficial to you to save up a little bit more money and go for a full frame camera instead of getting a APS-C crop sensor camera.
Yes, I agree with that sentiment. And especially for work like you do with concerts, with haunted houses, things like that, I know that you always make sure that you have your full frame with you,
Yeah.
because otherwise it's just not going to cut it.
And exactly, I have cameras that I use for, that kind of work, and then I have like my walk around camera, like if I'm doing like photojournalism just on the streets, I use a smaller compact ILC that is an APS-C size sensor camera. So I don't need all of that ISO control because I'm using mainly lower ISOs.
You're not
because I'm out
expecting to
in
be
the
in
sun.
those really
Yes.
low light situations.
Exactly.
All right, so should we wrap this up? I think
I
we've
think
pretty
we
much covered all of it.
covered everything.
To basically run down the whole thing once again, ISO is your camera's sensitivity to light. Shooting at a low ISO will yield clearer pictures with very little noise or grain. However, you will have to use a faster shutter speed. A slower shutter speed, rather,
Yes.
to let in more light, or you will have to use a faster lens that lets in more light.
Or you're going to need to find more light.
Or, of course, the most ideal situation, get more light. If you are in a dim situation, then a high ISO might work for you. A high ISO will increase your camera's sensitivity to light and will enable you to use faster shutter speeds and to get a proper exposure in dim situations. However, it will introduce noise to your photos, and it will introduce more noise as the number
higher it
goes up.
goes. Yes.
And we should also mention before we pack up for the day that there are cameras now that have ridiculous maximum ISOs, and they'll advertise their cameras to have these really great ISO levels. However, no matter what they say, those maximum ISOs have not proven to be very useful, even though you can use them. Having a max ISO of 25,600, for example,
You'll probably never use that ever.
it's still going to be grainy to a point where it's not aesthetically pleasing, I should say. I guess there will be situations where it works out for you, but having a max ISO is not the same as having a maximum pleasant ISO.
Yeah, there you go. Like even with my professional, my Canon 5D Mark IV, I really don't push that camera past 6400 ISO unless I really have to.
Yeah.
And that's
Alright.
pushing it a little bit. But in the end, basically, as far as you and your camera go, just play with your ISOs, take pictures at different ISOs, and see, basically where your limit is.
Yeah.
Like sometimes someone like with the same camera, they won't want to push past ISO 1600 because it gets too grainy for them. But someone else that has the same camera might say, "Oh, 1600 is fine. I can push it to 3200 and it still looks good to me."
My camera, I shoot with an A6000. When I have it set to ISO auto, it maxes out at 3200, which personally I don't find acceptable. I wish it maxed out at 1600, but then again, sometimes when I'm shooting in an auto mode, it will allow me to get pictures that I wouldn't be able to get sharp if I had set it to 1600. So
Gotcha.
sometimes the auto mode works out. But if your camera's set to ISO auto right now, take it off.
Yeah, give manual a shot.
Do a little experimenting. Go beyond the borders of the auto range, and try using your camera in dim situations where you don't have a lot of lighting, and see what you can push your camera to that is acceptable to you. And once you reach that limit, then you know for the future how far you can push your camera, and then at some point you'll just say, well, I guess I need to have faster lenses and break out the pocketbook.
Or, get a full frame camera.
Or you could get a full frame camera.
Or if that's not enough for you, a medium format.
Oh, God.
I hope I can afford one of those one of these days.
We're going to have to work on the discount program here if you want to afford medium format. Although there's not many options out there at the moment as far as digital goes.
I have to say, I think Fujifilm's got the best option right now.
And even that one is not, so they say, a true medium format. It's definitely bigger than a full frame.
Yeah.
But it's not the size of a real medium format digital back.
Yeah.
Which I guess is, I don't know the exact size, but it's bigger than that.
I don't know the exact size either. But anyway.
So anyway, I think that's about it when it comes to ISO. There it is, International Standards Organization, everybody. Yeah. But again, very important for the exposure triangle, and very important for your photography. So learn how it works, play with your camera, do a lot of experimenting, and before you know it, you will know shutter speed, aperture, and ISO inside and out, and it will help your photography immensely. And that's it.
All right.
All right. So until next time on Camera Academy, we will fix it in post.
Yeah.
That's our new catchphrase. Because I always have to fix things in post.
We always do.
It's a sad fact. Well, anyway, bye everybody. Oh my God, my voice. Bye.